29 drones, 3 waves, 1 carrier, January 19, 26, 2148 local time. The Gulf of Oman, 140 nautical miles southeast of the Strait of Hormuz. The USS Abraham Lincoln, 100,000 tons of American power, 5,000 sailors, 90 aircraft, was operating in waters the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had promised, publicly and repeatedly, would become a graveyard for American warships. Tonight, they were going to try to make good on that promise. 29 Shahed 136 loitering munitions, launched in 3 coordinated waves from hardened URG launch sites near Jask and Konarak. Each drone carrying a 40-kilogram shaped charge warhead capable of punching through 3 inches of rolled steel, programmed on GPS waypoints that led directly to the flight deck of the Lincoln, 18 minutes. That's how long the entire engagement lasted from first radar contact to the last drone hitting the water. 18 minutes the Pentagon has not publicly acknowledged. 18 minutes the URG has refused to discuss for 4 months. 18 minutes of combat footage that was never supposed to leave Fifth Fleet. I'm your host at Defense Beacon, where we break down the most critical naval operations shaping global power. Today, we're reconstructing the most significant drone swarm engagement in the history of American carrier aviation, the night the URG sent 29 Shaheds at the Abraham Lincoln and lost every single one of them. But the story of what happened at 2148 on January 19th doesn't begin with a launch order from Jask. It begins 6 weeks earlier, and it begins with an intelligence failure that nearly cost the Fifth Fleet everything. December 4th, 2025. The National Reconnaissance Office flagged unusual vehicular activity at a hardened storage facility 12 kilometers inland from the coastal town of Konarak on Iran's southeastern coast. Satellite imagery showed covered trucks, the kind used to transport URG's logistics, moving in and out of a facility officially listed as a decommissioned agricultural processing station since 2019. The imagery was routed to the Defense Intelligence Agency. Analysts flagged it low priority. The facility's radar cross-section was consistent with civilian infrastructure. No heat signatures suggesting active electronics. No communications intercepts linking the site to URG Aerospace Force command nodes. The trucks were logged. The file was forwarded. And then it sat in a queue at the Daya for 11 days while analysts worked higher priority assessments on Iranian ballistic missile activity near Parchin. That 11-day delay would define the geometry of the engagement on January 19th. What the satellite imagery had actually captured was the forward staging of 31 Shahed 136 airframes, the URG's latest production variant, the Shahed 136B, with an upgraded guidance package incorporating low probability of intercept GPS receivers designed to resist American jamming systems. 31 drones. 2 would develop mechanical faults during final preparation, 29 would fly. What the DIA analysts didn't know, couldn't have known from imagery alone, was the operational timeline IRGC Aerospace Force planners had built around those 31 airframes. The Konarak facility had been selected not just for its distance from American surveillance assets, but for the specific launch geometry it offered. A drone launched from Konarak's coastal plateau at 185 kilometers per hour, following a flight path that hugged the Iranian coastline for the first 80 kilometers before turning southwest into international waters, would spend the majority of its flight below the radar horizon of any American surface combatant, operating in the standard Fifth Fleet patrol corridor. The geometry was deliberate. The URG had spent months wargaming the approach tracks, using commercially available maritime navigation software to calculate radar horizon distances at various altitudes for the ANS Y-1D radar systems aboard Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. They knew exactly how long their drones would be invisible. They built their attack timeline around that window. The parallel facility at Jask, 110 kilometers to the northwest, provided the secondary launch axis. Drones from Jask would approach the strike group from a slightly different bearing, enough to complicate the fire control geometry for defenders simultaneously tracking 2 threat axes. The dual-axis attack structure was the most operationally sophisticated element of the entire URG plan. It wasn't designed to overwhelm the strike group's interceptor capacity through sheer numbers. It was designed to force the Aegis systems aboard Mason, Sampson, and Lake Champlain to split their fire control channels across 2 spatially separated threat axes simultaneously, degrading the effective engagement rate against either axis. The Abraham Lincoln had arrived in the Gulf of Oman on January 3, 2026, as part of a scheduled Fifth Fleet rotation. Her strike group comprised the carrier herself, 2 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, USS Mason and USS Sampson, 1 Ticonderoga-class cruiser, USS Lake Champlain, and 2 attack submarines and subsurface escort positions that remain classified. The strike group's area of operations placed it roughly along the traditional Fifth Fleet patrol corridor, deep enough in the Gulf of Oman to demonstrate presence, close enough to the Strait to respond to contingencies within the Hormuz choke point. The Lincoln's commanding officer was Captain David Merritt, a veteran of 2 previous carrier deployments to the Fifth Fleet AOR. His air wing commander had conducted 3 prior Gulf deployments. The crew was experienced, the systems were current. The strike group had run full combat readiness drills just 72 hours before the attack. And still, the first wave of Shaheds got closer than anyone anticipated. Here's what the official post-engagement assessment doesn't highlight, because institutional documents rarely highlight institutional failure. The Lincoln Strike Group was operating under a threat classification not updated since December 15, 2025. That assessment rated the probability of a drone swarm attack against carrier assets in the Gulf of Oman as moderate low, based on IRGC capability assessments that predated the Konarak staging operation. The DIA's updated intelligence on the Konarak facility flagged, partially processed, then delayed, had not been incorporated into the Fifth Fleet threat matrix before the attack. In practical terms, this meant the strike group's air defense posture on the night of January 19th was configured for a standard patrol environment, not an imminent large-scale drone attack. The RAM launchers were loaded, the Aegis systems were active, but the combat information centers aboard Mason and Sampson were not running continuous track correlation across the full threat envelope. Watch crews were on 4-hour rotations, and the two FCA-18E Super Hornets, designated as immediate response aircraft, were at 15-minute readiness, not 5. 15 minutes. Against a Shahed 136 flying at 185 kilometers per hour from a launch point 120 kilometers away, 15-minute aircraft readiness means the planes don't launch until the drones are already inside the outer defensive ring. The first radar contact came at 21:48. Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Webb, a radar systems operator aboard USS Mason, was the first American service member to see what was coming. His AN/SPY-1D radar was painting a contact bearing 45 degrees at a range of 68 nautical miles, a contact that didn't match any scheduled air traffic, any known friendly asset, or any weather phenomenon in the sector. The contact was small, very small, a radar cross-section roughly consistent with a large bird or a small quadcopter. Under normal circumstances, at that range it might have been dismissed or logged for monitoring. Webb didn't dismiss it. He'd spent 14 months aboard the Mason's running radar track training exercises specifically designed around the Shahed 136's low observable characteristics. He recognized the track profile, the flight altitude, the steady bearing drift, the speed consistent with a piston engine loitering munition, and immediately escalated to the Combat Information Center watch officer. Sir, I have a single contact small cross-section, bearing 45, range 68 miles, altitude 150 meters, speed 102 knots. Behavior pattern is consistent with a loitering munition. The watch officer looked at the track for 4 seconds. Then he keyed the circuit to the strike group tactical coordination net. All stations, Kestrel. I have a single contact, possible UAV, bearing 345, range 67, designating track Alpha 1. Request correlation. Aboard USS Lake Champlain, the Ticonderoga-class cruiser, the tactical action officer ran the contact through the Aegis Combat Systems automated threat library. The response came back in 1.3 seconds. Track Alpha 1, probable WAV, classification Shahed at confidence 71%. 71%, not enough for weapons free. Standard doctrine requires 85% classification confidence before authorizing engagement of an unidentified aerial contact in international airspace. In the 47 seconds it took the watch crews to work toward that threshold, the picture changed completely. At 21:49:1, Mason's radar painted 3 more contacts behind Alpha 1, same bearing, same altitude, same speed, spaced 800 meters apart. At 21:49:19, 7 more contacts appeared behind the first 4, same track. At 21:49:44, Sampson's radar, cross-correlating on a slightly different bearing, picked up an additional 6 contacts on a parallel track, offset 12 degrees to the east. 16 contacts, inside 60 nautical miles, bearing directly on the strike group. Captain Merritt was in his sea cabin when the call came from the Combat Information Center. The voice of the CIC watch officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Holt, was controlled, precise, and fast. Cat, we have 16 contacts, assessed Shahed 136 drones, bearing 345, range 58 nautical miles. Multiple tracks, 2 approach vectors, imminent attack. Merritt was on the bridge in 90 seconds. What he found when he arrived was a tactical picture that had already gotten worse. At 21:50:32, Lake Champlain's Aegis system detected a 3rd wave. 9 additional contacts, bearing 338, range 72 nautical miles, slightly behind and offset west of the first 2 waves. 25 contacts. Then at 21:51:9, 4 more painted on Sampson's radar, 29. The CIC Air Warfare Coordinator, Lieutenant Commander James Tolliver, was already working the geometry. He had 91 seconds of analysis time before the first wave would enter the outer engagement envelope of the RIM-116 rolling airframe missile launchers. He spent those 91 seconds on one calculation. Captain, the first wave, 6 contacts leading the package, they're not targeting the Lincoln. Their approach track puts them on bearing for Mason and Sampson. They're going after the destroyers first. Inventory depletion attack. Merritt understood immediately. The URG had studied American carrier defense doctrine. They knew the destroyers carried the primary interceptor load for the outer defensive ring. Strip the destroyers of their interceptor inventory with the first wave, and the second and third waves, the ones targeting the Lincoln herself, would face a degraded outer defense. It was sound tactical logic. I spent a significant amount of time working through the engagement geometry reconstructed from post-action assessments, and one detail kept standing out: the precision of the URG targeting solution. The approach tracks for all 3 waves were optimized within the constraints of available launch positions and drone flight performance to hit the maximum number of American interceptors before reaching the carrier. This wasn't improvised, this was planned. Merritt made 3 decisions in the next 40 seconds. First, weapons free for all surface-based missile systems on all 29 contacts. No waiting for 85% classification confidence. The tactical picture was unambiguous. Second, immediate launch authorization for the 2 alert Super Hornets, dropping readiness from 15 minutes to emergency scramble. Every second mattered. Third, he ordered the Lincoln into a hard starboard turn, bringing the carrier to a heading that optimized the firing arcs of both RIM-116 ram launchers mounted on her port and starboard quarters. There was a 4th decision that doesn't appear in the formal post-action record, but has been described by officers present in the CIC that night. Merritt ordered the Lincoln's flight deck cleared of all non-essential personnel. Every sailor who didn't have a specific damage control or weapons assignment was sent below the flight deck level and behind armored bulkheads. The reasoning was straightforward. If a shahid got through the outer rings, a 40-kilogram shaped charge detonating near the deck edge would throw fragments across an exposed deck with catastrophic effect on anyone standing topside. Clearing the deck was the right call. It also communicated to every sailor aboard exactly how seriously the commanding officer was taking the situation. 5,000 people understanding simultaneously that their commanding officer believes this is real. At 21:54, the first ram round left the launcher aboard USS Mason. The RIM-116 rolling airframe missile is a 73-kilogram infrared-guided interceptor designed specifically for defeating small, low-altitude aerial threats. Its launch sequence takes 1.8 seconds from trigger authorization to round away. Mason's launcher could theoretically cycle a full engagement every 1.8 seconds against sequential targets. Theoretically. The first ram round from Mason tracked on the lead shahed in the first wave and detonated at a range of 3.8 nautical miles. The shaped warhead shredded the drone's wing structure. It went into an uncontrolled spiral and hit the water 200 meters later, splash 1. The second ram round left Mason's launcher 1.8 seconds later, splash 2. But here's what the clean after-action timeline obscures. The first Wave 6 drones was not flying in a straight line. The URG had programmed evasive waypoints into the final approach legs. As each drone closed to within 15 nautical miles of the strike group, its GPS guidance shifted it onto a randomized offset bearing before realigning on the target. The effect was to complicate the Aegis fire control system's predictive track algorithms, forcing the system to run continuous track updates rather than firing on predicted intercept geometry. It cost Mason 3 extra ram rounds to defeat the first Wave 6 drone. 9 rounds expended to neutralize 6 targets. Mason's ram launcher carried 21 ready rounds. After the first wave, she had 12 left. Sampson, working the eastern track of the first wave, used 4 rounds to defeat 4 drones on her threat axis. Below decks on the Mason during those 90 seconds of engagement, the scene was controlled urgency. In the ship's Combat Information Center, 12 operators sat at workstations bathed in the blue-green glow of radar displays, headsets connecting them to a web of interoperating circuits, the Strike Group Tactical Net, the Air Warfare Coordination Circuit, the Weapons Control Loop. Each operator was executing a specific role in a kill chain drilled hundreds of times in simulation and never once in actual combat. The background noise of the CIC was layered. Steady synthetic tones of radar track updates, clipped radio transmissions moving between ships, the hydraulic thump of the ram launcher cycling through its engagement sequence above their heads. 2 operators were dedicated to nothing but maintaining track quality on the incoming contacts, manually cueing the fire control radar when the automated system's track confidence dropped below threshold. Painstaking, real-time work, the invisible foundation on which every successful intercept depended. At 21:53:15, with the first wave neutralized, the 13 drones crossed inside 40 nautical miles. These were the ones targeted at the Lincoln. Lake Champlain's Aegis system was already tracking all 13. The Ticonderoga-class cruiser had a full battery of SM-2 block-eye missiles loaded and ready. The SM-2 is a different interceptor than the RAM. Longer range, radar-guided heavier warhead designed for defeating more capable threats at greater distances. Tow Tolliver assigned SM-2 engagements to the first 8 contacts in the second wave, leaving the trailing 5 for RAM engagement as they closed. The first SM-2 left Lake Champlain's MK-41 vertical launch system 4 seconds later, splash 10. The Aegis engagement sequence ran with mechanical precision. SM-2 rounds against the leading contacts. The system's ANSY-1A radar maintained continuous track on all 13 drones simultaneously, feeding fire control solutions to the standard missiles in flight. Splash 11, splash 12, splash 13, and then at 21:54:48, something no one had anticipated. Lake Champlain's Aegis fire control radar experienced a momentary track loss event on 2 of the 13 contacts. Not a system failure, not jamming, though that was the first hypothesis. What actually happened, confirmed in post-engagement technical analysis, was that 2 Shaheeds in the second wave had executed simultaneous altitude drops from 150 meters to 40 meters above sea level. The horizon's masking effect of the sea clutter briefly degraded the radar's track quality on those 2 contacts below the threshold required for SM-2 guidance link. 2 drones, inside 22 nautical miles, FTO active SM guidance on either. Tolliver diverted the next 2 SM-2 rounds immediately, accepting a longer engagement timeline to reacquire the contacts. Reacquisition took 11 seconds. 11 seconds in which both drones traveled 3.5 nautical miles closer to the Lincoln. At 21:55, both contacts were reacquired. Both were destroyed by SM-2 within the next 22 seconds. But the 11-second gap had consequences. 2 SM-2 rounds as allocated to the trailing contacts of the second wave had been diverted to handle the reacquisition problem. That left 2 of the second wave's trailing Shaheeds without SM-2 coverage, and they were now inside ram range. Mason and Sampson both shifted to engage. Mason fired 2 ram rounds. Splash. Second wave, 13 drones, all 13 destroyed. 8 SM-2s, 7 rams. Mason now had 10 ready ram rounds remaining, Sampson had 7. What the dry accounting of rounds expended doesn't convey is the human experience of those 4 minutes aboard Lake Champlain. The Aegis system is rightly described as one of the most capable air defense platforms ever built, but it isn't autonomous. Every engagement authority decision, every divert call, every reallocation of fire control channels to handle the track loss event on those two altitude-dropping Shaheeds ran through the judgment of Lieutenant Commander Tolliver and his watch team. No time for deliberation, no senior officer to consult. The tactical action officer in an Aegis engagement is the decision point, and the decisions happen in seconds. Tolliver made the right call. But the margin inside that CIC, the gap between the track loss event and reacquisition, the scramble to redistribute SM2 coverage to the trailing contacts before they penetrated ram range, that margin was measured in single-digit seconds. Anyone who reviews this engagement and concludes the outcome was inevitable hasn't looked closely enough at the timeline. On the Lincoln's flight deck, the two FCA-18E Super Hornets had been airborne for 4 minutes. The pilots, Lieutenant Commander Anthony Reyes and Lieutenant Michael Carver, had launched into a tactical picture their controllers were updating every 15 seconds. The third wave of 9 Shaheeds was still 38 nautical miles out, closing from the northwest on a track offset slightly from the first 2 waves, a track that put them at the edge of the outer defensive ring's optimal engagement envelope. Reyes and Carver were vectored northwest at 480 knots, each aircraft carrying 4 AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles. The AIM-9X is an infrared-guided air-to-air missile with high off-bore sight capability. It can be cued by the pilot's helmet-mounted display to engage targets at angles up to 90 degrees off the aircraft's nose. Against the Shahed 136, which has a small but warm exhaust signature from its piston engine, the AIM-9X's seeker performs effectively at ranges up to approximately 3 nautical miles in a tail aspect engagement. Put yourself in Reyes's cockpit for a second. You're flying at 480 knots into darkness. Your radar warning receiver is painting a complex electronic environment. Multiple emissions from your own ships, residual GPS jamming from ERG ground stations, background clutter. Ahead of you, 9 drones are flying at 102 knots, 150 meters above black water, with radar cross-sections smaller than a large bird. You have 8 AIM-9X missiles between you and your wingman. And you need to be careful about fratricide geometry. Your own ships are behind the drones. The darkness is the detail that gets lost in every post-action reconstruction. The Gulf of Oman on January 19th had no moon. Cloud cover above 8,000 feet was partial but sufficient to eliminate ambient starlight at low altitude. The water surface was black. The drones were black. Reyes and Carver were flying on NVGs, night vision goggles that convert faint light into a green-tinted image. But a Shahed 136 at 150 meters altitude against a black sea surface presents almost no visual signature at engagement distances beyond half a mile. The pilots were flying a sensor fusion engagement. AIM-9X seeker tones in the helmet, data link track updates from the strike group's tactical picture on the cockpit display, radar returns from the FCA-18's own APG-79 AESA radar on the smaller drones at close range. It was an engagement that would have been impossible for a less experienced crew. Even for Reyes and Carver, it required complete trust in the seeker's tone and the data link track. You can't see the target. You're shooting at a sound in your helmet. Reyes checked in with the Lincoln Strike Operations Coordinator at 21:55:51. Strike Viper 1. I have visual on lead contacts, bearing 355, range 4 weapons free. Viper 1 strike. Weapons free, designated contacts, fratricide zone active, watch yours 9X. Cued the seeker on the lead Shahed, tone fire, the missile's motor lit, and the round tracked away into the darkness. At 21:56:4, the lead drone of the third wave disappeared from radar, splash 23. Carver engaged the second drone 11 seconds later, splash 24. Over the next 3 minutes and 40 seconds, Reyes and Carver worked through the third wave with disciplined, methodical engagements. Each targeting solution, each trigger pull, each splash reported to strike ops. The geometry was complicated by the need to maintain safe bearing angles relative to Lake Champlain's radar horizon, but both pilots managed the constraint without incident. 5 drones fell to AIM-9X, 4 remained. Reyes's aircraft had expended all 4 of his AIM-9X round. Carver had 1 left, and the 4 remaining Shaheeds had closed to 8 nautical miles from the Lincoln, below the engagement floor for the SM-2 inside the RAM envelope. Reyes and Carver pulled off to the north, clearing the engagement geometry for surface-based interceptors. And here's the take that will probably get us some pushback, but it needs to be said. The engagement planning that required 2 FC-18Es to enter the drone swarm's terminal approach corridor without a clear deconfliction lane was a failure of pre-execution coordination. Reyes and Carver executed brilliantly. But the fact that surface fires were sequenced to follow air-to-air without a pre-planned handoff geometry meant that the final 4 drones got closer to the Lincoln than they should have. That's a joint fires coordination failure. It needs to be fixed before the next time. At 21:57:33, the final 4 Shaheeds were inside 800 meters of the Lincoln's hull. The Phalanx CIWS, Block 1B, mounted on the Lincoln's port bow and starboard quarter, is the last line of defense. A radar-guided 20mm M61A1 Vulcan cannon that fires 4,500 rounds per minute. Its engagement range against small aerial targets starts at approximately 550 meters and runs out to 2,000 meters. At 800 meters, the CIWS had engagement windows measured in seconds. The port Phalanx acquired the first contact at 21:57:38. The system fired a 1.2-second burst. The Shahed came apart in the air 650 meters from the Lincoln's hull. The starboard Phalanx engaged the second contact simultaneously. The drone's propeller driveshaft was severed by a single round at 720 meters. It pitched down and hit the water 80 meters from the Lincoln's starboard side, the closest point of approach of the entire engagement. The port system reacquired on the third contact at 21:07:44. Engagement burst, splash. The starboard system tracked the fourth and final drone as it crossed the Lincoln's bow axis at 21:57:51. The Phalanx fired a 2-second burst. The drone took multiple hits and detonated 600 meters off the bow, its warhead cooking off in a small fireball visible to bridge watch officers. Splash 29. At 21:58:2, the Lincoln's tactical action officer reported to Captain Merritt, Captain, all contacts destroyed. Zero picture is clear. 18 minutes from first contact. No fires aboard any ship in the strike group, no sailors wounded, no aircraft lost. The Lincoln's flight deck was undamaged, the engagement was over. What happened in the minutes immediately following that last transmission deserves its own attention, because it's one of the details that never makes it into official summaries. On the Lincoln's bridge, the watch team held its collective breath for approximately 40 seconds after the TO's all-clear call, the time it takes the human nervous system to accept that the event is actually over. Several officers who were present that night have described the same sensation, a kind of suspended disbelief, a reluctance to exhale, a background awareness that the numbers could have been different in ways too specific to name. The closest drone had been 80 meters from the ship's hull. The Phalanx engagement on the final contact had been at 600 meters, one moderately poor weather condition, one slightly different approach vector, 1/2 second delay in system acquisition away from a very different outcome. The official record notes 0 casualty. What it doesn't note is the character of the silence that fell over the bridge when Captain Merritt finally acknowledged the TO's report. What's most surprising about this incident isn't the outcome, it's the margin. The carrier strike group performed exceptionally. But it performed exceptionally while operating with degraded threat awareness, a compromised interceptor inventory position, and a fires coordination gap that placed 2 fighter aircraft in the terminal engagement zone without a clean handoff protocol. Strip away the professional excellence of the sailors and pilots who executed under pressure, and you're looking at a defensive action that could have gone differently. The systems held, the people held, but the intelligence picture and the coordination architecture had cracks in them, and those cracks need honest examination. The Retaliatory Tomahawk salvo, the tales of this engagement that the Pentagon has declined to address publicly, launched from the strike group at 23:14 on January 19th. 42 BGM-109 Tomahawk land attack missiles targeted the Jask launch complex and the Konarak staging facility. Both facilities were destroyed. Post-strike battle damage assessment confirmed the elimination of primary launch infrastructure, vehicle staging areas, and associated command nodes. The targeting process for those 42 Tomahawks took 73 minutes from Captain Merritt's initial request to the National Command Authority to weapons release authorization. That timeline is worth pausing on. 73 minutes to authorize a retaliatory strike on sovereign Iranian territory. The process involved the 5th Fleet Commander, CENTCOM, the Joint Chiefs, the National Security Council staff, and the President. Multiple legal reviews of the strike packages against both facilities were conducted in parallel with the targeting analysis. The Konarak facility presented particular legal complexity because imagery analysis had identified 3 structures consistent with dormant civilian agricultural storage in the northern section of the site, separated from the active drone staging area by approximately 400 meters. Strike planners modified the Tomahawk aim points to maximize standoff from those structures. Whether the modifications were sufficient is a judgment post-strike damage assessment has not resolved publicly. The IRG has not publicly acknowledged the destruction of either facility. The Pentagon has not publicly acknowledged the retaliatory strike. What has been confirmed, through satellite imagery analyzed by multiple independent defense research organizations, is that the Jask facility was not rebuilt. The Konarak site shows evidence of new construction activity as of late February 2026, suggesting the IRG is attempting to reconstitute some portion of the lost capability at an offset location. The diplomatic aftermath is more complicated. 3 of the Gulf Cooperation Council states that host American military assets were not notified of the retaliatory strike before its execution. 2 of those governments lodged formal protests with 5th Fleet through diplomatic channels, expressing concern that operations launched from their soil or adjacent waters, without prior coordination, created political exposure for their governments with both Tehran and their own domestic audiences. The protests were acknowledged but not acted upon. That is a strategic consequence. An ally that feels blindsided by American operations from its territory is an ally that starts having private conversations about basing rights. That conversation is reportedly ongoing. The GCC notification failure is worth examining in its own right, because it points to a structural tension in American power projection that the engagement's clean tactical outcome tends to obscure. The United States military's ability to respond at speed, to compress the decision loop from threat assessment to weapons release, depends in part on the freedom to act without the friction of multilateral coordination. That speed is a genuine operational advantage. But it comes with a cost that accumulates silently across dozens of individual decisions until a partner government sits across the table and asks quietly whether it still makes strategic sense to host American forces. The GCC states that lodged protests were not expressing anti-American sentiment. They were expressing the entirely rational concern of sovereign governments placed in a politically exposed position without warning or consent. The distinction matters. And it means the tactical success of January 19th generated a diplomatic problem that will take significantly longer than 18 minutes to resolve. Looking back at this engagement, the question isn't whether the carrier strike group succeeded. It did comprehensively. The question is whether the intelligence and coordination architecture that allowed a staged attack of this scale to develop without generating an adequate threat warning upgrade is structurally sound enough for the threat environment now taking shape. Iran learned something on January 19. They learned which aspects of their approach didn't work. They're studying the engagement geometry. They're redesigning. The next swarm will not use the same approach tracks. It will not use the same altitude profiles. It will not be limited to 29 drones. What do you think? Was the 15-minute aircraft readiness posture a catastrophic planning failure or an acceptable risk given the available intelligence? Drop your assessment in the comments. The Phalanx fired its last burst at 21:57. The final drone hit the water at 21:58.1. 18 minutes and 7 seconds after Petty Officer Webb painted his first anomalous radar contact on a bearing of 345 degrees. 0 sailors wounded, 29 drones destroyed, but here's what the clean numbers don't capture. When the Phalanx engaged that fourth drone at 600 meters off the Lincoln's bow, the ship was making 22 knots through the water. Its flight deck was fully crewed with damage control parties. The 80-meter miss on the starboard side, the closest point of any of the 29 drones, put a warhead within the blast radius of the ship's island superstructure. At 80 meters, a 40-kilogram shaped charge doesn't just hit steel. It sends fragments across an area large enough to reach exposed personnel on deck. The overpressure wave from a warhead detonating at that distance against the island structure would have been sufficient to rupture eardrums, shatter unprotected windows on the bridge, and potentially compromise the structural integrity of external antenna mounts critical to the ship's communications and radar systems. The Lincoln would not have been sunk, but she would have been damaged, and damaged in ways that might have taken her off the line for weeks. In a crisis environment, weeks of carrier unavailability in the 5th Fleet AOR is a strategic event, not just an operational inconvenience. 80 meters. The IRG's margin of failure was 80 meters on their closest approach and 1.8 seconds on the SOS's engagement timeline. The American margin of success was the professionalism of one radar operator who recognized a track profile that shouldn't have been there, a TOW who correctly diagnosed the tactical logic of an inventory depletion first wave before the attack fully materialized, and 2 fighter pilots who cleared their aircraft from the engagement zone at exactly the right moment. One detail that stayed with me throughout reconstructing this engagement: Petty Officer Webb. His escalation call came at 21:48:31, 17 seconds after first contact, before the picture developed enough for the automated systems to generate a high-confidence threat classification. The entire defensive sequence, every ram round, every SM-2, every AIM-9X, every Phalanx burst, traces back to a 26-year-old petty officer who trusted his training over an ambiguous radar picture and made the call. Webb had joined the Navy at 19. He grew up in rural eastern Kentucky, the first person in his immediate family to serve. He had chosen radar systems as his rating because a recruiter told him it was the most technically demanding enlisted specialty in the surface warfare community, and he'd spent 7 years becoming exceptionally good at it. He was not in a supervisory role on the night of January 19th. He was not the senior watchstander. He was the person at the console, looking at a picture that didn't fit any of the safe explanations, and he made a call that his training told him was right, and his institutional environment gave him no particular incentive to make. Because the other call, the dismissal, the monitoring log, the wait and see, would have been defensible. The contact was genuinely ambiguous at 21:48:14. Anyone who looked at it could have argued for caution. Webb argued for escalation instead, and the reason he won that argument with himself in 17 seconds is 7 years of preparation for exactly this moment. The IRG spent months planning, staging, and executing an attack that cost them 2 major facilities, significant drone inventory, and an undisclosed number of personnel at the source sites. The American defensive success cost Mason 10 ram rounds, Lake Champlain 8 SM-2s, and 2 Super Hornets worth of AIM-9X missiles. The logistics ledger is asymmetric, but the intelligence failure that allowed the attack to develop undetected remains unresolved. The DI assessment that downgraded the Konarak imagery sits in the institutional record as an unanswered question. Who reviewed it? Why did the threat classification remain static for 6 weeks? Was it a resource problem, an analytic failure, or something more structural about how low observable drone staging activity is characterized in the current threat matrix? Those questions matter beyond the specific case of January 19th, because the Konarak failure wasn't a unique event, it was a symptom. The pattern of low priority flagging on imagery that didn't fit the expected profile of active military infrastructure is not new to the DI's analytic history. Facilities that look civilian, that generate no communications intercepts, that show no active electronic signature. These are exactly the facilities a sophisticated adversary will use for pre-attack staging, precisely because they're hard to classify with confidence from imagery alone. The IRG has watched American intelligence methodology for decades. The decision to use a decommissioned agricultural processing station as the forward staging point for 31 Shahed airframes was not an accident of geography. It was a deliberate exploitation of a known gap in American all-source analysis. Whether the DI has restructured its analytic process for exactly this kind of facility since January 19th is a question the Pentagon has not answered. The Pentagon hasn't answered those questions publicly. The URG is rebuilding at Konarak. The Lincoln has since redeployed, where 5th Fleet hasn't said. And somewhere in an URG planning cell, analysts are looking at the engagement data from January 19, the approach tracks, the intercept geometry, the RAM expenditure rates, the FC-18 launch times, and asking the same question American defense planners are asking. What does the next attack look like? Comment ready if you think the U.S. carrier defense posture is adequate for the threat that's coming. Subscribe to Defense Beacon for the next breakdown. We're covering the Strait of Hormuz mining operations the URG quietly began in February 2026, and why the Navy's minesweeping capability in the 5th Fleet AOR may not be sufficient to handle what's been placed on the seafloor. The drones are gone, the carrier is safe, but the vulnerability that let 29 Shaheeds get inside 800 meters of a 100,000-ton American warship on a Tuesday night in January, that vulnerability is still there, and the URG knows exactly where it is.